Well, let me start with a title, Solving. I'm not going to solve it tonight. But I'm hoping we can help together see what paths will be needed to solve these issues. And these issues are really, in many ways, linked. There's not any single link among all the things I'm going to talk about tonight, but there are a variety of links in them. And many of these links, we are fortunate, go in the direction of improving one improves others. Economists would say we're far from the trade-off frontier right now. There's a lot we can do and gain in all directions. So, food systems. There are about 7.6 billion of us on Earth, and we all eat food. And the ability of a few percent of us to grow the food and provide it to us day by day, year by year, is what allows all the rest of us to have the kinds of lives that we have, where we can spend time being academics or physicians or attorneys or any other profession there might be. We have that luxury because of the global food system. And stable food systems, as we know, are essential for stable societies. We saw what happened in 2008 when food systems were destabilized and some of the at least partially correlated societal changes that occurred in response to that. But there's another side of the food system that has to do with the harm that it creates. So about 1/4 of all greenhouse gases come from the various steps in the production and processing of foods. Agriculture requires lots of land. Lots of ecosystems have been destroyed. More will be destroyed, which is threatening species with extinction. Agriculture is a major cause of pollution of lakes, rivers, streams, groundwaters, drinking waters. And what we see right now is only the beginning of what will happen. No one would ever have made these assertions 50 years ago. In the last 50 years, the world has changed immensely, but it is still changing very, very rapidly. We know one reason why. Global population is increasing. There are 17 times more people now than there were in 1500. So think about, as somebody who lives in the newly discovered lands, at least newly discovered by Europeans, in North America, in that period of time, population has gone up by a factor of 17. And it's going to go up about 38% more in the next 50 years. Now, there are 2.5 or so billion people. That, though, is actually the small part of why these problems exist. This is really what does it. This is gross world product. The value of all goods and services produced on the world, going back again, some brave economists estimated for 1,500, and I borrowed those numbers, not questioning their validity. But by those estimates, we have 1,330 times the economic activity now than we had in 1500. And if you look at what is forecasted to happen, the projections are about a 350% increase in the total global production of goods and products in the next 50 years, compared to the 38% in population, which means there's about a 3-time greater rate of increase in, there's about per capita incomes are increasing about by a factor of 3 on average across the world in the next 50 years. So not only will there be more people, but there'll be more people who have the power to buy more. And it is our purchasing of goods and services, whatever they are, that lead us to have the impacts that we have on Earth. So let's look at how income influences consumption. Here for food. This are the kilocalories of food brought in per person per day to households around the world. Each dot is a year for a given part of the world. The parts of the world are divided up here geographically. And what you can see is that people with very low incomes bring in just about enough calories to make it on average for a country, around 2,000 or so kilocalories per day. And as income goes up, more and more food is brought into households, such as the richest countries are bringing in on the average of 3,500 kilocalories per day. That gives you a sense of how the increasing income that we're going to be seeing might impact consumption. But the sense is not quite right until you look at something else. How many calories of crops have to be grown to provide that food? And here, the number is quite astounding. The richest people in the world, the richest nations in the world on average now, are causing about 8,500 kilocalories of crops to be grown per person per day to be able to get the 3,500 kilocalories of food they bring into the house, of which they eat about 2,800 calories, and the rest is wasted. So there's a huge impact of increasing income on demand for the production of crops. And production of crops, as we'll see, has some serious consequences. Now, what kinds of crops are being grown, and why do we have so much more crop being grown than food being brought into the home? The major reason is the thing shown on top, meat production. This is grams of meat grams of meat protein brought into a house, the upper graph here, per person per day. In the poorest countries, it's around 2 or 3 grams. In the richest countries, it's over 30 grams. A huge influence on the per capita demand for meat. As we know, meat, animal products, animals eat to produce it. Cattle consume about 20 kilograms of plant protein to get 1 kilogram of edible beef. And the ratios are much better for pork. It's around 5.5 or 6, and chicken around 4. But still, it is that rapid increase, income-dependent increase in meat consumption, which is causing this demand for 8,500 calories of crop production to give us the 3,500 calories brought into a home by a typical rich person in the world. And if you look at where these dots are now, these are various regions of the world. If you imagine what their income is now and what will happen when their income increases 200 or 300%, these people here will be up here. These here will be up here, and so on. As they move up the curve, there's an immense increase in demand, which is why many estimates are that although we will only have 38% more people in 50 years, we're going to probably need to produce double or slightly more than double the amount of crops that we produce right now to provide them the diets they are demanding. So these diets that I showed you, let me just go back a bit. I didn't mention the other two. The next graph are kilocalories of sugars, fats, and alcohol brought into the home per person per day. These are called the healthy calories, right? I want to make sure you're awake, okay? Empty calories might be a better word for them. And then the bottom is just the total number of calories, I guess, which I already showed you, so I won't bother with that. But both these empty calories and meat are going up very rapidly with income all around the world. This dietary change is called by nutritionists the global, it's called the nutrition transition. And it's because of this nutrition transition that we have a huge increase in the global burden of disease. For instance, in China, 25 years ago, less than 1% of the population of China had diabetes. It's now about 12%. 1 in 8 people has diabetes. And people of Asian descent, on average, get diabetes with a much smaller increase in body mass index and at a much younger age than do people of European origin. So they're having diabetes, type 2 diabetes, as a real epidemic there. And all India has the same kind of issue all around the world as these diets change toward meat, sugar, starches, alcohol. Diabetes is increasing, heart disease is increasing, stroke is increasing, and cancers are increasing. And these diseases, the World Health Organization said, will become the major burden of disease for the whole world by the year 2030. In fact, some estimates are it'll be a bit sooner than that. It's happening more rapidly than they imagined when they wrote this report in 2010. So these dietary shifts, which have environmental impacts, have some very serious health impacts. So I'm going to mainly look at 3 linked elements between diet, other factors, and environmental responses to them. The first one will be a quick look at climate. We all know what the big issue is with climate change. It is greenhouse gas combustion releasing about 75% of the greenhouse gas equivalents that are emitted every year on Earth. The other 25% is food consumption. If we are going to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of a 1.5 degree Celsius increase, we have a problem. Let me show you what this problem is now. The emissions from agriculture, as I show here, come from lots of different sources. This is something that you can see something like this in many vegan restaurants or vegetarian restaurants. A little diagram of greenhouse gas emitted by production of various kinds of foods. And you notice the green foods here are all of the cereals, oils, fats, sugars, fruits, and vegetables, very low emissions. And then we get into the dairy and egg with higher emissions, then into fish, which depending on how they're caught or produced can be sort of moderate to high emissions, and then into poultry, pork, and ruminant meat. And ruminant meat have the highest of all these emissions, about 200 times per gram of protein for ruminant meats compared to, let's say, to the same amount of protein from a soybean. Well, because of this dietary shift toward these really high greenhouse gas emitting foods in their production that is happening all around the world, we can see what the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, how they stack up and what they imply. Right now, our current emissions are around 9 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. And we forecast by the year 2100, these emissions will be around 20. That's based upon increased population and increased incomes and change in diet associated with income. Now, the IPCC says for us to achieve a 1.5 degree C warming maximum for the world, we have to have annual greenhouse gas emissions at the green line from now till the year 2100. Right now, the food we produce is above that line. And the food we are likely to produce by the year 2100 is well above that line. In fact, it's above the emission limit per year on average from now till 2100 for a 2 degree C climate change. So even if we do what all of us hope we do, which is find a way to stop using fossil fuels, just our food system itself is a major challenge that we have to address and find solutions to these problems if we want to have a world that doesn't exceed 1.5 or 2 degrees C warming by the end of this century. So the good news is we know that there are diets that are much healthier, diets that people used to eat before we had this global nutrition transition toward high levels of diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancers. And lots of research has been done in these by nutritionists. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm really drawing in knowledge from many different areas to give you this information today. But this is we summarized this in a paper we had in Nature in 2014 with Mike Clark, who's now a postdoc here. Here are the effects, the reduction in disease risk, of disease incidence, percent reduction, associated with the classic Mediterranean diet, which is a diet high in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, olive oil. Fish is the main meat, a little bit serving a week of either beef or pork or chicken. So it's not what the people who live in the Mediterranean eat anymore, but it's what they used to eat on the shores of the Mediterranean in the past, which is associated with great longevity. And these diets, the Mediterranean diet, a pescatarian is a bit like the Mediterranean, but the only meat is from fish. And then the vegetarian diet. On average, we're having about 30% less diabetes in people who have one of these three diets, and highest with the vegetarian. There aren't enough data yet for these long-term cohort studies to comment on what a vegan diet will do. Everyone has their guesses. I'm not willing to guess. Incidence of cancer is down about 10% because of these diets. Mortality from heart disease is down around 20% from these different diets. And overall, all-cause mortality is down around 10% or so from the diets. So we can ask, well, what would happen if the world adopted one or more of these diets? What would that do to address the greenhouse gas issues that we face coming from agriculture? So again, the same diagram before, but with some more bars on it. So there's the business as usual diet, the 2100 diet if everyone follows the past trends. But then there's a Mediterranean diet, you can see here. It gets us almost down to 2 degrees C. There's a Mediterranean diet, I'm reading it crooked here. Mediterranean diet, below 2 degrees C. The pescatarian and the vegetarian both are close enough to 1.5 degrees. You could say you probably could make it on those. A vegan diet is quite a bit less. Now, how many of you think the whole world is going to become vegans? I love you people, but I sort of vote with the majority on this. I wish that would happen. I don't think it's going to happen. The good news about what I'm going to show you today is that it doesn't take any one of these solutions. Any one of these, partly achieving the diet along with other things, can solve this problem. There are lots of little partial solutions which together means we don't have to have the whole world become vegan or vegetarian, but clearly if we have the whole world stay on our current diets or switch over to the even heavier meat diets, we can't solve this problem. So dietary change has to be part of it, but it doesn't have to be the full-fledged all the way to vegan dietary change to achieve the goal. And here are a couple cases where I want to show that. You can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture by reducing waste. By having people eat just the 2,400 kilocalories a day they should eat, not the 3,500 they shouldn't eat. and by increasing the efficiency of agriculture and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use and from nitrogen fertilizer. That sort of cuts the bar down to here. If you combine that with an equal representation of that diet, that diet, that diet, and that diet, you get down to this bar here where you just achieve the 1.5 degrees C. Or if you just have the Mediterranean diet combined with that, the net effect is getting it down again to the 1.5 degrees C. So there are lots of mixtures of diets, equal representation of the 4 diets furthest to the right on the screen, the 4 rightest blue bars there, combined with these other agricultural practices, can help us achieve that 1.5 degree solution. Now, one other way you can look at this instead of diets are just individual foods. And again, this is now Mike Clark's work. I'm all there, or Al, I guess. I'm Al. This shows the relative risk of heart disease, of mortality, heart disease, diabetes, and stroke versus the greenhouse gas emissions associated with each of the different food groups. W are whole grains, L are legume, N are nuts, D is dairy, V are vegetables, FR are fruits, FI is fish, M is red meats, P are processed red meats, B are sugary beverages, and S are sugar, just refined sugar. And the most important thing to note here is that the y-axis is on a log scale. Relatively small changes in diet lead to relatively large changes in the environmental impact of those dietary changes. And so having diets move down toward the greener foods, the more fruit and vegetable, plant-based foods, along that has a really big benefit. There's a health benefit which is occurring there, which could be 5 or 10 years of better high-quality life, disease-free, low morbidity life. But that is associated also with a very big benefit for greenhouse gases. Okay, problem 2, water pollution. It was a very large problem in the United States until the Clean Water Act was passed, which greatly improved it. But many nations that are undergoing rapid development are having large problems with water quality, including it impacting the quality and the viability of drinking water that is taken from lakes, rivers, and so on. It comes from fertilizer mainly, and there are some pesticide effects, but mainly it's from fertilizers. And fertilizers dissolve in the water and get into the well water, et cetera, and move around the world. And this is happening because of how we are producing food. The reason we're able to feed 7.5 billion people right now is that we apply lots of fertilizers, giving us very high yields. Right now, we're now applying 110 million tons of nitrogen as in various available forms globally, whereas when the Green Revolution began, we were applying 10. So we've gone up by a factor of 11 in how much nitrogen fertilizer we are applying, and in doing that, we increased food production by about 150%. So the return on investment isn't maybe as high as we would like from how much fertilizer it takes to increase food production, but it does have other benefits. But the same thing is true for phosphorus and irrigation. As we grow more and more food, we're having these unintended but very serious consequences from them. And don't forget, nitrogen also in soil generates nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas. So applying nitrogen not only pollutes the water, but it contributes greatly to climate warming. About 10% of climate warming comes from that. Well, to give the quickest summary, many papers written on this by other scholars, we basically are now doubling the amount of nitrogen that comes into terrestrial ecosystems and doubling the amount of phosphorus that is made available in terrestrial ecosystems compared to what it was, let's say, pre-modern agriculture. These are really big environmental impacts that double something to have that large of a global impact on the cycles of these elements. And these are the elements that not only limit the rate of growth of our crop plants, they limit the rate of growth of all sorts of other organisms. The rooted macrophyte plants here in the Gulf of Mexico, the algae that grow there, the phytoplankton and so on, all grow in response to this. So here's a low nitrogen loading area in the Gulf. Here's an area where the Mississippi River flows in. That's algae in the water. As you know, the algae grows, and when it dies, bacteria eat it. When the bacteria consume it, the bacteria also consume oxygen. They drive oxygen levels down to close to zero, which kills off the fish. named by the fishermen the dead zone. And all the major rivers draining agriculture areas around the world have these kind of dead zones. So you can ask what can be done about this. Well, partly diets help, because here instead of greenhouse gas is the eutrophication intensity associated with the production of all these different food types. Again, it's a log linear relationship. The same diets that decrease your incidence of diabetes and decrease greenhouse gas emission also decrease nitrogen and phosphorus loading into aquatic environments. So all these dots are from a summary of life cycle analyses as well as the health impacts. So full life cycle analyses let us know what the impacts of growing different kinds of foods are, and growing the greener foods down there, the more plant-based foods have much lower impacts, as much as 100-fold less than the animal-based foods higher up. So the same dietary changes which reduce greenhouse gas emissions simultaneously reduce nutrient loading. So we can feed people healthier diets that are also much better for water quality all around the world. But you might think, well, some of that pollution just must be an unavoidable cost of feeding 7.5 billion people. And that is somewhat true, but I tell you it's not as true as I imagined it might be until I had read a lot of other work that's been done on this. There have been many studies done by agronomists asking how much fertilizer do you have to add to get a certain yield. And in particular, trying to find out if you can add fertilizer at certain times when crops have highest demand and have the crops take it up quickly before it has a chance to leach and be out into the groundwater. And there are all these practices called precision agriculture, which does that now. So a more precise, efficient use of fertilizer means that a higher proportion of the fertilizer you add ends up being in the plant, which means there's less of it sitting around dissolved in soil pore water, which can be leached out then when rainwater carries that into the groundwater and rivers and streams. Lower levels of nitrate means there's less nitrous oxide. And the release of nitrous oxide basically goes up exponentially with the amount of nitrogen you add as fertilizer to a field. So you have a huge gain in nitrous oxide reductions by having precision agriculture. The other thing which can be done, because a lot of leaching happens when plants aren't growing in the non-growing season, in the fall, the winter, and the spring, is to plant cover crops, which will have roots in the soil and take up some of those nutrients, reducing leaching then. And you can plant cover crops that are nitrogen-fixing crops, like legumes, that will actually negate some of the need to produce nitrogen fertilizer for that field. All these things help. These are all sort of going a step beyond, I call these postmodern agriculture. Modern agriculture was just add fertilizer. That started with John Laws at Rothamsted in 1843, and it's going to be slowing down. No, what I want to show you I think is really amazing, because if you were like me and are a skeptic, you might say, well, this is all fine on paper, but can it actually work in the real world? Well, the EU did a wonderful experiment. I will not mention any other thing about that now. And they imposed what was called the Nitrate Directive in 1995, which was designed to have farmers apply less nitrogen fertilizer to help improve water quality throughout the EU. And farmers had to fill out forms and do soil testing to get permission to apply a certain amount of nitrogen. Now what has happened, if you graph the yield, in this case it's the amount of protein produced per hectare from all the crops in each of the countries of Europe, versus time, that yield, crop protein per hectare has been going up linearly. It still is going up linearly, even though what you see here, the x-axis is the amount of nitrogen fertilized used per hectare. And you can see that is going down. In France, since 1995, it's gone down about 10%. In Germany, it's gone down about 25%. In Italy, it's gone down about 10%. All three of those countries have had their yields increase while adding less nitrogen fertilizer, because when farmers were forced to think about it, they could actually maintain their yields by adding the right amount of fertilizer at the right time on a whole nation basis. The same thing happened almost in parallel in Mexico for a totally different reason. Mexico was a green revolution country. It heavily subsidized fertilizer and improved seed for farmers to get them to have higher yields. By the mid-1990s, they decided their farmers are doing well financially, and they phased out the fertilizer subsidy, and wise farmers realized they could keep getting the yield they were getting, apply less fertilizer, save money for themselves, but get the same kind of yield. And their yields have gone up along the same yield increasing curve, but they're now adding 30% less fertilizer than they were in the mid-1990s. So this really works. It even worked without the EU knowing what they're going to do, but they did a wonderful experiment and showed there's great promise for the rest of the world. China especially is way, way out on the end of that, could really benefit from this, but so could many other nations. Now the last problem, I guess I have to talk more quickly.
10 minutes.
I'm joking. I have 2 hours, don't I? No, actually, this will be fine. I want to talk about extinction. Agriculture uses about 40% of the ice-free land surface of the world for cropland and pasture. And more ecosystems are being cleared all the time. Well, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has evaluated all of the bird and all the mammal species known on Earth as to what their status was as far as whether they were threatened with extinction or not. And of all the birds and mammals threatened with extinction, about 75 to 80%, the IUCN said were threatened because of land clearing for agriculture. They're also threatened because of land clearing by logging, and a lot of logging land becomes pasture and farmland afterwards. They're also threatened by development and other clearing of land. Those are big threats. And the only other really big threat that they listed there was food. This is people killing wild animals as game, as a source of protein. So basically, our desire for food is, and our need to have land to produce it as well as to hunt wild game, is our major threats to biodiversity around the world. And I want to quickly show you what was the last 25 years of my life in 4 slides or something. So this question arose, does it matter if we lose biological diversity? So we set up an experiment, the first one like this in the world, where we manipulated how many species were in each plot. We controlled them to have 1 species or 2, 4, 8, or 16. We planted these in native, prairie, perennial plants, the common plants in that region, and tallgrass prairie. We randomized them as to which species were where and how many species were in each plot and so on. So it's a fully randomized experiment. And here's what we found in it. 1 are monocultures. 2 species plots, 4, 8, out to 16 species plots. Here are all the monocultures. There's the single best species growing in monoculture. Every single plot planted with 16 species is more productive than that. And on average, 16 species plots are more than 200% more productive than the average species growing in monoculture. There's a huge premium from diversity in nature. More diverse systems, species coexist in nature because they're different, just like different professions coexist in our economy, because the professions are different from each other, and if you're good at one profession, you really don't have the time to be good at another one. It takes 25 or 30 years to become a professor. You don't have time to go off and become a physician and attorney and everything else. Well, nature has the same thing in it. There are all these trade-offs among organisms. These trade-offs mean that organisms do one thing well and other things poorly. When organisms compete in nature, they only are allowed to do what they do well. They're outcompeted for all the things they do poorly. Just like if you were a profession who tried to practice medicine, you'd be outcompeted as well as jailed pretty quickly. So that's, in a nutshell, why it is that there's this incredible effect of diversity on how productive an ecosystem is. And diversity also influences what happens in the long term to the soils. Soil carbon is a bigger store of carbon than is in all the biomass, all the trees and plants on Earth. It's bigger than what's in the atmosphere. It's the single largest terrestrial store of carbon is in soils. And these soils gain an immense amount of carbon at high diversity and gain very little at low diversity. There's a feedback effect of this diversity on soil carbon storage, which is a very important service that we get from high diversity ecosystems. More diverse grasslands have greater diversity of insects living in them. I'll just quickly say that and move on. More diverse systems are more stable. The amount of biomass you can harvest from a grassland is not only larger at high diversity, it has less year-to-year variation at high diversity. And there's a lot of wonderful math and theory and other data behind this, but I'll just tell you that's the case. And in fact, when you look at all the different things that ecologists have learned through the years influence the productivity of grasslands, and we looked at these. We have fire or no fire, we have herbivores present or not, we add carbon dioxide, mimicking what's happening in the atmosphere, it's a plant nutrient. We impose drought, we add water, we add different amounts of nitrogen, and we change diversity. We have as large or larger impacts from changing diversity that we have from adding as much nitrogen as a farmer would put on maize. Diversity is incredibly important for how these systems function in nature, and we are simplifying the world massively by all the land that we convert into cropland, pasture, and so on. So, and this is not just a thing of the past. We know we are clearing land all around the world. The Amazon, and it might have a spike coming very soon. Malaysia, Indonesia to grow oil palm. The United States to grow more maize. We plowed under 10 million acres of virgin grassland in the last decade in the United States. So, when we look at how diets are changing and where we're going, we estimate we're going to need about 700 million more hectares of land cleared in the tropics around the world to feed people. And what that's going to do, just quickly look at this. Most of the threatened species in the world, this is a map showing how many threatened species there are for large mammals, are right now here in Asia. And here's where most of the large mammals are. They're in sub-Saharan Africa. The threats are pretty low. But here's what's happening. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to have a 1.7 billion estimated increase in population. They have some of the most rapidly growing economies in the world. They are basically like Asia was 50 or 60 years ago. That's what's happening here now. And our estimates are that because of this, here's current average risk in sub-Saharan Africa for large mammals. Here's where we project it is going to be in the year 2060. Because of increased population, increased food demand with population income, and the land that would have to be cleared to meet that food demand. Here's where Asia is now, where so many things are threatened, and it's going to be much higher than that. South America also high. Basically, this economic and population growth around the world is going to put most larger mammals around the world on the brink of extinction. So, you can imagine some of the things we can do to help prevent this. We already talked about how healthier diets and decreased waste have some benefits. Another benefit they have is they need less land to produce that food. When you don't grow a third of the grains in the world to feed livestock, you don't need as much land, and you don't need as much land in the future as you might need otherwise. So just changing diets has a big effect. There's something else called closing yield gaps I'll talk about in a minute, but I'll show you changing diets here. So here is how much cropland around the world we estimate would not need to be cleared if the whole world adopted a Mediterranean diet. 500 million out of the 700 million would not have to be cleared. Pescatarian diet would get it down to around 600 million, and a vegetarian I think is around 650 million hectares would not need to be cleared. So basically shifting diets in the direction that is healthier greatly decreases the amount of land it would take to feed the 9.5 billion people we expect to have on the world by the time that we're making these estimates, 50 years into the future. So again, diet can be a big lever. But there are other big levers. Here are yields on average for the last 10 or so years in the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The amount of food produced, tons of protein produced per hectare. Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, China. And here's how much nitrogen fertilizer they had. I'm not saying that there's a direct one-to-one relationship. The land and climate is different here, here, and here. But there's a lot of work by agronomists showing that most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have enough rainwater coming in that they could double or triple their yields from where they are right now. And if you do that, doubling yields cuts in half how much land you have to clear to feed people. So a more rapid increase in yields in sub-Saharan African nations could go a long way toward preventing the extinction risk, as well as providing them with the food security they need. So, I think I'm there. So now I get to have a slower summary. So I guess what I want to assert, I tried to give you 3 vignettes on 3 major environmental problems and some of the solutions. Diet is one that goes through them all, but diet is not the only solution, and diet doesn't have to be the only solution. Let's start with the biggest picture, climate change. Clearly, we have to have renewable energy sources replace fossil fuels. And I would not want to come to you and not emphasize that, because I totally know that's true and want to emphasize it. But as I wanted to point out, if we want to achieve a 1.5 or 2 degree limit to global warming, we have to do more than that. And diets will be a very important part of that, as well as anything else which can make agriculture more efficient. Postmodern agriculture if you will, using all the inputs as effectively as possible, planting the right crops in the right places. I would assert having better trade among nations so that on average we have nations that have the highest yields for a given crop grow more of it, and have that be a pattern across nations. That trade, yield-dependent trade, could go a long way toward reducing how much land we need to feed the world. Closing yield gaps, having nations which currently are only producing a third or a fourth or a fifth of the food per acre or hectare that they could have, helping those nations close that gap, getting them up on the curve where they're still environmentally efficiently using their inputs, but having doubled or tripled their yields. That can have a huge impact on these issues. Reducing waste is another one. Waste is like entropy. It's unavoidable. But the amounts we waste right now are, I would say, inexcusable. In a typical Western country, 30 to 40% of the food brought into a household is wasted. We have to find solutions to that problem. The other thing that we need to do on the diversity side is that we need to look ahead. We have to ask, where are species living in what kinds of lands in each nation? What lands do these nations have that are going to be fertile and provide them with food? How can we find the right mix of using some of the land that is not yet cleared to help them meet their food demand, but saving other lands to help preserve biodiversity? It'll be tough, on the ground, real investigation of what's happening nation by nation around the world. But if we don't do that, if we don't plan ahead, we're going to have highly fragmented landscapes, which is what we have in the rest of the world already, which make it very hard for especially larger organisms to survive in the face of habitat destruction. The same amount of land left in the right blocks can preserve many more species than lots of little postage stamps, which is what we tend to do around the world. So these are what we have to do. These are all very doable things. I think to me, the serious problem we face is what will motivate us to do this. What would motivate people to change their diets? What would motivate governments to plan ahead? What would motivate richer nations to help provide aid to poor nations so they can close their yield gaps? What will motivate farmers to use their inputs more efficiently? I gave two examples. One was a price example, one is a regulation example for what happened in Europe and Mexico. Those are two obvious levers. I think in each of us in our own areas come up with different solutions. My economic friends have economic solutions. My political science friends have political solutions. I think we need lots of solutions. We have lots of problems. They're all interlinked. And I'm hoping that you here can help solve these problems. Thank you.